Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 37th episode of the Truth Island podcast. Life sometimes has a funny way of sending us mixed messages. On one hand, we are told by our loved ones that we must be grateful for the things that we have. We must be grateful for having a roof over our head, food to eat, and a family that loves and cares for us. We are taught that gratitude is a supreme virtue and that no matter how bad we perceive things, can always be worse, and that there are others that have marched before us in much tougher shoes than we are currently wearing. Such themes are enshrined in the teachings of Buddhism, which preach that if a person can successfully give up their desires, they may stand a chance of achieving enlightenment. On the other hand, our society also values accomplishment and achievement. We are told that we are lazy or slothful if we remain stagnant or stuck in the same position for too long. We should all aspire to rise the corporate ladder and become powerful so that we may direct others, buy a bigger home, live in a more desirable zip code, and impress people with the buckets of accomplishment that we have accrued throughout our lifetime. But how is it possible for a person to both be ambitious and desire success, but at the same time be grateful for their current plight? For example, should an employee learn to be complacent and grateful in their current situation, or is it only right and natural that they should dream of achieving more? I am once again joined with Sam, who is going to help me understand when exactly we should be content laying on a picnic blanket and when it's time to get up and find greener pastures. Sam, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. It's great to be here. I wanted to just begin by talking about this issue of contentment and ambition in my own life. Growing up, I had a very strong dad figure. I mean, he was a strong disciplinarian, very religiously minded, very task oriented, and then I also had a strong older brother. So I was the middle of five children. And so my oldest brother and my dad were kind of two major figures in my upbringing and my sort of self-development, my self-conception. And where they come into play with my story about contentment and ambition is sort of the two poles in my heart and my mind about how I think about my place in the world, how hard to push sometimes, and then when to pull back. Growing up, my dad was a big advocate for the Christian virtues of self-control and self-restraint and Christian duty and being grateful. I spoke in a previous podcast about certain emotions that were off limits growing up, like unhappiness or even kind of sadness to a degree. Not liking something or not enjoying something was not an option. You sort of always had to, if something was hard or hurtful, take a licking, keep on ticking, as I mentioned before, but also just keep your head up and do your duty.
Sam, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Would you describe your father as let's just say that your father had a really busy day and he was kind of taking you along to the hardware store or something like that,
Yeah.
and you would maybe ask for Dad, I really want ice cream. Would he be kind of the father that would say, not right now, like it's just not appropriate for you to have that desire?
My dad had moments of indulgence. We would go to Walker, which was the closest town, 750 people, and
Yeah.
he would do errands on Main Street, the post office, and the print shop, and the bank, and there was a bowling alley that was open in the mornings for coffee and stuff like that. And before I went to school, I would go with him, and he loved to go in there and read the paper while he'd buy me like a bag of M&Ms or Skittles or something like that. And that was a huge deal because we never went out. We never had like nice things like that. Or we go to Independence, which was the county seat town of 5,000 people. And we'd go to the Dairy Queen on the river there. And I don't even know if you know what Dairy Queen is, but
Ice
it's a big
cream, right?
yeah, exactly. And but we were never allowed to get like a blizzard, which was like the kind of the nice ice cream dish. We
Ah,
would have to get like a cone, or maybe if we were lucky, like a hot fudge sundae, but something a little bit cheaper. So my dad had moments where he would really, indulge, especially if it was just you and him. There was more of a chance of kind of attention in that regard. But generally speaking, no, I would say.
I'm giving your dad some props because I like that he did allow some indulgence into the picture, but I like that
Yeah.
it's not unrestrained indulgence. Like he takes you to the Dairy Queen and it's like, okay, there are rules here on how much we're going to indulge on this ice cream. And I think that's like a very important, like kind of lesson that perhaps your dad was, I don't know if he was directly trying to instill, but maybe inadvertently instilled in you.
Yeah, and that kind of touches on something we talked about last time, which is that you've noticed a trend in parenting, maybe among parents our age or a little older, of kind of having no constraints, emotionally or with in terms of rules, like just not being good at setting boundaries. And I remember kind of growing up with a real sense of propriety and decorum. Whenever I was in public, a temper tantrum was not even, it was unthinkable,
Mm.
or any kind of public display of emotion, or we were in people's homes a lot because my dad did work where he was, promoting different ministries and organization, and he would do that really personally at people's homes and places of work and things like that. And so I was, from an early age, really familiar with the inside of other people's homes and places. And so that is one thing that I really value from my upbringing, is like there was a sense of a lot of constraint and propriety. So like you never acted out. And even to this day, I'll see people with their children in public and they're just, running amok. And I do feel a little, I don't feel as much disdain as I used to. I don't feel as judgmental as I used to, because I know, the struggle is real. But I do count my blessings, that was never an issue for us growing up. And I want to be the same kind of father figure at some point, hopefully.
And it's kind of this idea of like a touch of complacency. Like, for example, if you're, let's
Yeah.
say, in the hardware store and your immediate desire is beckoning at you, I need that ice cream. I need that ice cream. Where your father is like, okay, ice cream is not a never thing. Like that's not like it's not
No.
completely forbidden and banned forever. However, we need to develop complacency in this hardware store so that
Yeah.
we can earn that ice cream later on.
Yeah, and that's served me well. I've been in New York several months now, and you've got to find ways of cutting corners, financially, to save money, whether that's, make a cup of coffee at home instead of go out and buy a $6 latte. And so those rural prairie values that I learned in the upper Midwest growing up have served me well. My grandma, my dad's mom, grew up right in the middle of the Depression, and right in the middle of it, she got married and had her first child, and her mom died. And so my dad, a lot of those values and traits were passed on to my dad. And I think that they've served me well these last several months in New York, where, I spent about half this year, 2020, not earning a paycheck. And I have earned a paycheck for the last, several months here, but it's not been a ton of money. And I've had to, figure out the whole astronomical rent thing in New York, and just the higher cost of living. Even go to the grocery store is more expensive. So those traits have served me well, and I'm grateful for those, for sure. Yeah, and so back to the constraints thing. So on one hand, I have this pole. And I think of, like, North and South Pole is kind of my idea there, of my dad and his kind of the limiting voice that he was on me, a voice of restraint and contentment.
Hmm.
You need to be happy with what you have. And you need to, kind of, in a sense, stifle your own ambition for the sake of Christian duty, and for the sake of just, that's just the way we do it, kind of thing, almost like family tradition.
Yeah, let me ask you this. When you say stifling ambition, now it's very easy to see like the value in the ice cream and the hardware store example. In terms of your father's ambition, in terms of like career and things like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
was it a sense of Christian duty? Like, I'm going to take this job that perhaps pays less, but is going to allow me to better serve the community or play a specific role. So I'm like, did that also play into your father's worldview?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And these are some of the things that I'm still kind of figuring out and working out, even in my adult years. And I think that's true for all people. We spend a lot of time sorting out our childhood. But yeah, I think the answer to your question is yes. I think my dad's messaging belied his own sense of ambition. My dad was and is a talented communicator, and he's really good at promoting a cause, and he's very persuasive and passionate. And I think that my dad wanted to go really far with his life. I think he once told me, and I don't know how serious he was, but I think he wanted to be kind of in like national leadership, even, like
Wow.
go into to public policy and politics and be the president, basically, kind of setting his sights high, on whatever that was. And in the end, my dad ended up in back in the town that he grew up in. He was the only child of his seven siblings that came back to this rural enclave in that township called Kono out in rural Iowa, and he ran the school that his dad started. And it's interesting to think about. One of my favorite movies is It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Stewart
Yeah,
and
it's a
Donna
great
Reed, and
film. Yeah.
yeah, it's just, and I like it so much because I mean I think it's really beautifully written in a lot of ways, and I love some of the tropes in it, of course, but I really relate to the story, like on a family level, like this young promising guy who wants to shake the dust of this crummy town off his feet and go see the world. He wants to be an architect, and he wants to go to Fiji and all these, work for the National Geographic, maybe. He wants to do everything. And I think my dad had some of that in him, honestly. And he could have, but like Jimmy Stewart, like George Bailey in this film, he's constantly pulled back into the orbit of his family and his family business, sort of, so to speak. Right around the time my dad was kind of coming up and had an opportunity to maybe to Washington D.C. I think that's where he wanted to go. His dad died, and I think I've never talked to my dad about this, but I just thinking about the chronology of his life. I think just like George Bailey, his dad died at this important juncture, and he's pulled back to Bedford Falls to run Bailey Building and Loans. And my dad is right around that time. It was a year or two later he moved back to Iowa, and he helped run the school for this ministry that my grandfather started. He did it for 30 years from 81 on, and that's where we all grew up. And so I think my dad had some um, of his own kind of disappointment, maybe, or stifled ambition. And I think I don't know if he ever really got the opportunity to process that and what that meant for him, but somehow the messaging to me, and probably to my siblings, although I've never talked to them about it, is that you kind of have to go back to the family farm, and you need to go back to and run the family business if need be, and you need to set your sights low. Maybe that was his way of protecting himself from maybe the sadness of unaccomplished goals, things that he wasn't able to do in his life. Maybe that was his way of kind of coping.
It's interesting that you're saying this, because I think that there is no correct answer to all of this, because on one hand we also have individuals in this world who are like, if I only became more powerful, if I only became more powerful, if I only was president, if only I was a CEO, I would change it all. I would really, really change it all. And meanwhile, they've kind of neglected the things back at home, like the
Yeah,
things back at home that really need order. And then you kind of scratch your chin a little bit, being like, well, you've sort of left your family or your home situation kind of in a bit of chaos. And now you're telling us that you can hold on to this like higher level of responsibility, whereas you kind of neglected the responsibility that was put before you. And
yeah.
I think that's and it's these are tough questions, Sam. Like I don't know exactly what is the right line to draw there.
They are tough questions, and I like your point there, because there is something good and beautiful about what George Bailey does in It's a Wonderful Life. He comes back to a town, and he leads that community. He ends up being sort of the leader, the moral leader of that community. And he saves a lot of lives, and he helps a lot of people. And I think the same is true for my dad. My dad was able to come back and do some really great things. But as I got older, I think I discovered that brother, this other figure in my life, was maybe in some ways the mouthpiece of my dad's real heart, like what my dad, kind of the heartbeat of his own ambition, sort of kind of worked its way out in an awkward way through my brother and the things that he would tell me and kind of his influence on my life. And so, and I didn't really wake up to my brother's influence until kind of around college and right after college. So kind of early 20s, but it was there for a long time. And I think my brother's message,
Your brother's
what,
older than you, right?
5 years older, exactly 5 years
Okay.
older. And my brother was tremendously ambitious. Like my dad, he wanted to, his favorite movie, he wanted to do journalism like my dad had done for a short time, and he communications kind of thing. And their favorite movie is All the President's Men, Robert Redford, and getting the story and digging deep, and like doing it in a place like Washington D.C., and like my brother, wanted to work for the New York Times, and he actually came to New York 10, 12, 14 years ago for a short journalism institute here in New York City, ground zero of journalism and stuff like that. So he had his sights set high too. And I think that it's kind of complicated, but I think that my dad's real heart on some of these issues came out through my brother. And so while my dad was much more kind of retiring, I'm using that as kind of just a general adjective of his, kind of resigned in some ways to his fate. I mean, it kind of gets back to some of the things you were saying with the Buddhist philosophy, although my dad is not Buddhist, but but that idea of kind of stepping back and then encouraging me in very spiritual terms to kind of embrace my calling right here and right now and do the next thing. While my dad is saying those things, and I do want to say more about that, my brother is telling me something very different.
Let me ask you this question. Is there some type of interplay between your father and your brother? Like, does your father also tell your older brother, hey, this is great and all, why don't we kind of rein it back here?
Yeah, they have an interesting relationship. So, early on, my brother and my dad had a very adversarial relationship. My brother was the rule breaker and the rebel, and my parents are this kind of pretty kind, like very conservative Christian couple trying to run this Christian organization, this ministry, this boarding school for troubled kids. And my brother, who's kind of supposed to be like a good kid because he's like, the headmaster's son essentially, is just raising Cain for them. So I think that was complicated. My brother and my dad butted heads, and at one point my brother was kind of shipped off because he's just too much. Like he had to go to somewhere else. Like somewhere else. So it was
When you
adversarial
say
at
when
first.
you say like a rebel rouser, do you mean in his like journalism activism work, or was there
No,
like
this was kind of before he left the house. This
okay.
was like high school. And then no, so he didn't really become a journalist activist until his 20s. And by that point, my dad is just really proud of him and encouraging him in his pursuits. Because I think in a lot of ways, my brother, the journalistic career that my dad kind of maybe wished he had had at some points, although I'm not saying that for sure, but maybe a little bit of that. So I think my brother was just encouraged by that point by my dad. But I think their relationship as far as ambition went it was like my dad had never worked through his own maybe feeling of disappointment, that he hadn't really arrived at his own goals, his own measure of kind of self-realization. I don't think my dad ever worked through that. And so while I think he tried to sort of mask the pain of that, maybe he kind of just, his only register was kind of a spiritual register, to say like, well, I can only understand this in terms of spiritual language and again that Christian kind of duty and responsibility. But because it was never really worked out in my dad kind of internally, I think it sort of like came through anyways. And that's so true for parenting. Like you don't have to say kind of certain things for them to sort of come out in the messaging to children and the way children think about the world. And I think that's what happened with my brother. And I think my brother absorbed that more than I did early on.
And it's tough, like, for your father because, especially I say this, like when it comes to ambition, some people have like the skill set and they have it, and then they had like an opportunity, and then that can be very difficult to kind of grapple with, because it's one thing to never have had the opportunity or never to have been in those higher circles or whatever and just be like, okay, this is my lot in life, or this is all I'm this is all I want, this is all I'm capable of, like these like not everyone's journey is the same. Not every father was in that position where they could just like grab like, oh yeah, I have a road here to the spiritual center of the universe. So
Right.
it's hard, I think, for some people when those opportunities are before them and then they don't pick it up.
It is. And just a couple examples of my dad's kind of spiritualizing tendency when it came to talking about contentment and ambition and my place in the world and what I should strive for. There were three things that came to mind as I was thinking about what I would say today. And one was a hymn that we sang. It was in our Trinity hymnal, this red hymnal with 742 hymns in it. And it was a kind of standard denominational hymn book. And there's a hymn in there written in the 1850s by a woman, and I think she was very sickly. And the 1800s was a hard century for everybody. So,
Sure was. I remember it like it was yesterday, though, Sam.
yeah, exactly. Especially the 1850s. We all remember that, right? But
Yeah.
she, I don't know many details about her, but I know that her hymn, it's entitled "Father, I Know That All My Life." And the first full line is Father as in God, Father, I know that all my life is portioned out for me. So the sense of like God has all your days planned and things like that. And then there's one phrase in there that my dad quoted to me, and I think on multiple occasions. And I remember one occasion even later where he just said, as there's this hymn and we knew it, it's a prayer that as a Christian, I would be content to fill a little space if God be glorified. And so this kind of coming back to the basics for my dad was kind of tremendous spiritual implication. Like you need to be content to fill a little space if that's what God wants, if that's what's going to make God happy. That doesn't leave a lot of room for what you want in that situation, but it's a very strong message.
Now, this is something, and this is something I may have gotten into your father with a little bit, in that, how do you know exactly what it is that God wants for
Yeah,
you? You
yeah,
know what I mean? Now, here's the deal. If I sent out a bunch of resumes to be CEO or something grand, and God just kept on shutting the door in my face, shutting the door in my face, like, sir, Mr. Azrod, it was a pleasure seeing you today, but no thanks, but no thanks. Then I would be like, okay, um, looks like God doesn't want me heading up this hill right now. And that's actually happened quite, I have to say, Sam, that's happened to me quite a bit. There's been plenty of jobs and positions that I've coveted and really wanted. And God just said, nope, not for you. And that's kind of where I agree with your father's interpretation of that, okay, it seems like these higher spheres are closed off to me. That's God giving me a signal to kind of be content. But then if I'm just sitting at home and not doing anything about it, how do I know exactly that that's what God wants me to
yeah.
do?
Yeah. And I don't know if I ever answered that question or got that question answered in childhood. I've had to sort of like hit my head against the wall on a few occasions, or the door, or however you want to take that metaphor. But I think closed doors that is kind of a helpful concept. Like you apply for something and you don't get it, or you go on a date with a woman and it doesn't work out. Like those, these are close.
Oh boy, tell me
Right,
about that
right. I
one.
mean, work and relationships. Those are kind of the two big ones, right?
Yeah.
And there are other examples, but yeah, I think a closed door is. I've come to appreciate that metaphor, although it's only been through time and honestly through the process of trial and error. And I think I underestimated how much God wants to teach us wisdom, chokmah, the skill of the art of godly living from
Huh.
Proverbs, that God wants to teach us wisdom through the age old process of trial and error. I think I was afraid of that. I was afraid of error, and I was
Yeah.
afraid of trial for sure. But God, I think that God wants to teach us some important lessons through that process.
Moving the discussion, in a previous podcast that you also listened to, I discussed with Daniel this idea of in Buddhism, there's this idea of being really, really, really content. And there's this idea of complacency. And Daniel would actually add that that's also an extension of Eastern philosophy as well,
Yeah.
because if you are not content, then you destroy the order of things in a very, very pronounced way. And that even goes to Confucius, and some, just like Confucius was very big on like respect your father,
Yes.
you
Yes.
know, like
Yes.
older, like younger brother needs to listen to older
Right.
brother. Like Confucius was really big on that. And there's this idea that if you're not complacent with what's going on around you, you threaten to destroy the social order that's around you.
Yeah.
And then I also revealed that in Judaism, that is a strong, strong religion of activism, of like, whoa, we got to get out of Egypt. Pharaoh is not treating us right.
Right.
We need to part this Red Sea and go right through there. So this is a huge conflict that I have in my own life, because I love listening to Buddhist teachings, and it helps with the materialism. It helps make those old sneakers that I have look really awesome and feel great, you know. So I get this like wonderful, wonderful feeling from Buddhism in helping me deal with materialism
Yeah.
and just silly nonsense going and getting ice cream kind of desires, right? Really
Yeah.
helpful. But then Judaism helps me with like, Aaron, you're just sitting here not doing all that much.
Right.
And I don't think that that's what you're meant to be doing right now. I'm curious to hear what is the Christian answer to this.
Man, that's a million dollar question. I think I love the way you've described that tension, and I feel it in my own self, my own inner being, 100%. I mean, I think that's some what you just said sums up a lot of my own struggle in adulthood, is when to sit back and be retiring, and when to get up and press on. I'm going to come to an answer, the Christian answer. I dabbled in yoga a little bit right before coronavirus, January, February. I was getting into yoga a little bit, just kind of more for the physical element of it. But it was interesting to hear people talk about it, at a lot of different yoga services. I was sorry, not services, but whatever you want to call them, yoga services. During the hour that you're in there for hot yoga or whatever, a lot of times the yoga instructor will give what amounts to basically like a short sermon. And there was such a strong and repeated theme of like having compassion for yourself. And that was new. That caught me off guard. And I realized how much of my life, I mean, you even said it just as we were starting to talk today, like, you need to don't be hard on yourself, like remember to give place to compassion for yourself, and extend grace to yourself in the same way that you would as someone else. And I mean, I don't know if that's exactly the same as what you're describing, the Buddhist and Judaism dichotomy. But I think that conversation about having compassion for myself extended into a contemplative mind and meditation, and just that kind of inner sanctuary side of life, which I haven't developed. And I haven't developed because my experience of the Christian faith has been so basically so much more Judaism oriented, at least in the way you're describing it. It's been not always the right or good kind of activism. Christians are misguided on that a lot of times, unfortunately, but just like the tyranny of the urgent is what I felt growing up. And a lot of that was justified in Christian terms, that there are things to do and you need to do them for the kingdom of God, and you need to do your duty basically. And but it was also spiritualized a lot of times, because my dad is very representative of a Midwesterner, a boomer of that generation, of that area, very task oriented, doesn't know how to rest, works works on vacation, that kind of thing. And it is tyrannical. It's a tyrannical way to grow up. And a lot of times in my house, it was justified in Christian terms, and this is what Christians do. But there were a lot of cultural things too. So I have not hit the balance on this, and I know that Christianity has resources for striking this balance, but I personally haven't worked it out.
This also reminds me of the Jewish idea of mitzvah. And mitzvah is just, a fancy word for doing good deeds.
Right.
And in Judaism, I think there is emphasis pressed on certain like following Shabbat, for example, is considered a mitzvah. Like that's like a good action. So I think there's this idea when it comes to like spiritual salvation that is tied differently with different religions. Whereas I think that you can reach salvation or enlightenment in Eastern philosophy by not necessarily the things that you do. And I think there is Buddhism. Like, I don't want to overgeneralize with this, because I think that like if I did speak to a Buddhist monk, they'd be like, "Yeah, you should totally help that elderly lady, and you should,
Mhm.
yeah, you should be doing
Yeah.
good behavior." Like, I don't want to characterize it as that. Like, it's definitely not just like sit in one place and do nothing all day. But
No.
I think with Buddhism, the ultimate goal is foregoing desire. And I've heard that, like every Buddhist book that I've read, I've heard that echoed 1,000 times over: forego desire. And I think that you could achieve enlightenment through foregoing desire and not necessarily take the most actions in your life, but still
Right.
reach this enlightened state. Whereas Judaism, and perhaps also in Christianity, since it is Judeo-Christian thought,
Right.
if you're not taking mitzvahs every day, if you're not doing hardcore action, and I think this is kind of the umbrella that your father fell under, then you may miss out on some kind of salvation.
For sure. And when I got to college, and especially seminary in the 2010s, I heard people talking about self-care. I had literally never heard that word before, that phrase, excuse me, self-care, this idea that you would, again, going back to this idea, having compassion for yourself and, resting and finding a good sort of rhythm in your life. That was totally new to me because the self growing up, especially in Christian terms, was always the last thing that you considered. And before that, you considered others and you considered your duty before God. And you never really stopped to think about what you needed or what you wanted. And so that was a really novel concept. And so I think, to use your dichotomy, I feel like I've been steeped in the sort of the Judaism side of things. Get off your butt, get off your butt and get busy. Right. And I think I'd like to be steeped a little bit more kind of in the Buddhism side of things, so to speak.
Absolutely. Now, both me and you are millennials, right? And
Yeah.
this is an issue that affects us, especially like we're both over 30, right?
Yep.
And I think 20s, you can totally have a relaxed lifestyle. Like, I think it's very easy for that to happen where you
Yeah.
go to college, you're told what to do, and then it's like, oh, I've never been to Japan. Let me go to Japan, right? Like, and you
Yeah.
have that, you have that kind of space to be
You
totally
do. You do.
complacent, and you have that you don't really need to have. And we're also, I have to say this, we're also guys. And for
Yeah.
us, we can have kids when we're in our early to mid 40s.
Right.
So like we have an advantage, we do have an unfair advantage over women in the
Right.
sense that we have a very long drawn out biological clock. So,
Yeah.
but eventually, once you start getting into your 30s, that ambition of like, geez Louise, I'm not going to be on this earth forever. I kind of need to start stepping it up a little bit.
Yeah.
That starts hitting you. And I think we discussed earlier that you have some great questions that people our age could sort of ask ourselves.
Yeah, totally. Thank you, man. I agree. And I felt that pressure, just before I come to those questions, I felt that pressure, in 2012, in the course of 10 months between end of December and the beginning of November. So end of December 2011 to November 2012, three of my four siblings got married. Yeah. And I was 24 at the time. And it really caught me off guard. And I think I felt a lot of pressure to sort of join the married ranks because in my family there's so much emphasis on marrying young and having children and contributing to to society and to especially to sort of Christian society. And I still haven't joined that 10 years later, just about. And there is still a pang that I feel about not having arrived at certain goals and benchmarks of my brothers and sisters when it comes to family, to marriage, to children, to jobs, even. And so I definitely feel that. Going back to your questions, though, I think that something we can really do for each other is just be as present as we can in each other's lives, and cultivate friendship. And then big part of friendship is helpful presence. And that goes all the way back to the early pages of Scripture. I think that's what part of what we're created for each other is help, a helpful presence. And one of the things that we can do is ask each other good questions. And asking questions is an art. It's an art form. It requires a lot of practice, trial and error, going back to that concept. But we can, especially when it comes to professional things and personal things, we can help each other by asking good questions. And I was just thinking, like, I think through the relationships that we pursue, and the jobs that we apply for, those are reflections of our values and reflections of what we're seeking in life. And so, we can draw each other out by asking good questions to those around us. I thought of a few that reflects kind of my 20s. There's a vision for each of our lives, and it may be our vision, or it may be our family's vision for our lives, or it may be what we think God wants for our lives. You asked earlier, how do we know what God wants? So just asking people and observing, like, whose vision for your life are you living out,
Yes, yes.
is so important. Who do you imagine is looking over your shoulder, as you do that job or pursue that thing, or whose voice is inside your head? Self-talk is so incredibly important. No one talks to you more than you. So, but there's voices inside of our head, and a lot of times it can be an ornery parent, or an overly ambitious older brother that says, "Hey, if you don't achieve these things, then what good are you? Whose legacy are you honoring?" I saw that in my parents so much. They were the youngest in their families, and their fathers were pastors. And I think their sense of identity and calling, as I was growing up, had so much to do with kind of carrying the story forward, of their family, and being standard bearers, of a certain family legacy and heritage that was very Christian. And I think they did that sometimes unquestioningly. And that both help and hurt, me and them, probably. Who are you trying to impress? That's such an important thing. And I think about dating, like, weirdly, this is kind of vulnerable to admit this, but to say that, like, if you were dating somebody who was like too pretty or something like that, like, there was suspicion, like, in a way, like, I had just a very, like, weird relationship to, like, pretty girls growing up, because it was like they're kind of off limits, because it was like vain to date them.
Right.
um,
Yeah,
you know
yeah. Vanity.
and vanity, yeah, exactly. And even now, like, it's a fair question to ask people who are dating, like, who are you trying to, or not just dating, but a job that you're seeking, or a decision that you're making.
Yeah,
Who are
yeah.
you trying to impress? Is that true to yourself? Is that genuine to yourself? And I think that we're all in search of a verdict. I felt that with my job hunting. I felt that with dating. We're longing for someone or something or some experience to sort of pronounce the final verdict over our lives, that we have arrived, that we have achieved what we set out to achieve, and that we are worthwhile.
I'm really liking this idea, and what you're saying reminds me of a quote from the psychologist Jordan Peterson, like, only compare yourself to the person you were the day before. Don't compare yourself to anyone else. And I also like this idea, Sam, of what you're saying, that there are eyes and ears that are in our brain of other people that are judging everything that we do. And this is all of us, whether you had a very soft dad or hard dad, but whatever it is, you have these people. And then have you ever had this thing, Sam, where you're doing something and then you're just like, you picture what your grandma would react to, and then you're like, oh, well, if my grandma was here and saw this, she would be that. And it's like, now I have to say that these voices and eyes can be a positive thing. Like if there's a kid
Yeah.
out there that is, someone offers that kid drugs and they have grandma's voice entering their head being like, you're my little Sam is going to take drugs. That's a good thing. It's good to have grandma's voice embedded in your mind, like preventing you from taking drugs or doing other questionable activity.
Yeah.
But then when it comes to something like your brother pursuing journalism, then we kind of need to silence those voices. And this is immensely difficult because sometimes
Is
grandma's voice is 100% correct, and then sometimes grandma has another voice on some other issue, and that's not really correct. And we have to kind of do the difficult sorting work.
Yeah, totally. And I think what you're describing is pretty natural, and common, and even kind of biblical. Like there's an idea like in Deuteronomy, even in the Shema, that you're instructed to teach your children the way of the Lord. And Moses refers to it later in Deuteronomy, and Isaiah picks up on it. This idea that we're sort of walking down the path, and these you could say the voices inside our head, not to sound weird about it, but the voices inside our head kind of keep us on the path. They keep us from veering to the right or to the left, and they sort of whisper, just stay the course. And so those are that was a huge part of seminary for me. Pastor training was a mentoring community of professors, and gaining a collection of voices inside my head, and many of them so wise.
Mm,
But a huge part of adulthood for me is sort of moving beyond just the basics of kind of an automatic robotic response to the voices that I've inherited, and becoming my own person. And that is what I call discernment. I mean, and that takes time and pain and sadness to learn. But it's worth it. It's worth it to become your own person, and to develop sort of your own voice. And it's kind of what it means to mature and become an adult in a lot of ways.
I like what you said about sadness because these voices typically are good people in your life. Like I love my grandma, like that's a good person in my life.
Yeah.
And you feel like I like if I list all of the things my grandma told me, I would say probably 85% of it is really awesome and
Yeah.
definitely sticking to it. But then you have this guilt of like in that 15% that maybe wasn't correct, you have guilt on so many levels. Like this was an older and wiser person. There's that. And that's like the Confucius thing where it's like you're defying an elder in some way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this creates immense levels of guilt. But then you have to ask yourself like, okay, I want to move forward, or maybe just maybe in this 15% area, like I can still love and respect my grandma, but at the same time, I have to differ, and it's not a disrespect thing. And God bless her wherever she is, she would see that and be like, you know what, maybe my grandson was right in that like
Yeah.
15%, and I just didn't see that, because no human being is
No.
perfect, no matter how old
No.
they get.
Yeah. When I started therapy, I went to professional therapy for about 18 months, between 2013 and 2015. And it was kind of encouraged, although not required by my seminary courses, to do that. And I'm so glad I did. And I talked briefly about that in our last podcast. But when I started, I felt like such a traitor, a Benedict Arnold, a Judas Iscariot, because it was like I was telling on my family,
Yes.
and I felt so bad about it, because like, but I had to do it. I kind of had to reckon with the past in order to move forward into the future. And to do that, I had to sort of tell on my family, and almost it felt slanderous. It felt slanderous, like I was, like I was gossiping about them, like telling stories about things that my my dad did or said, that hurt me or hampered me, or things that various caregivers did that weren't helpful. And it wasn't slanderous because it was in the confidentiality of therapy,
Right.
but at the same time I still felt really bad about it because I was sort of blowing up the family myths, about happiness and healthiness and wholeness. And yeah, there were aspects of that, but there were also a lot of toxic relationships growing up, and there were also a lot of really unhelpful dynamics and patterns that we inherited from previous generations. And so I felt like a little like a snitch. I felt like a brat, because I was doing that, but I had to do it. I had to blow up the colossus of the family myth, the family cult, to to move forward. And there was no other way. There was no other way.
Yes, and Sam, it's glad that you mentioned, because I think this is something we all struggle with like blowing up the family colossus. I like the way you described it,
Thank you.
but I think that there is always that possibility that you'll grow from that very careful examination. And
Yeah.
it's not like this universal condemning of your family, like everything they taught me was wrong. It's like it's not
Right.
that at all. That has
No.
to be very clear. And
No.
I think our movies and our things are very, our media is very black and white, where it's like, screw you, dad, I'm going to show you the real
Right.
way to do this. And it's a really black and white depiction, but it's actually not that at all. It's a very
No.
careful and methodical sorting of every little thing. And then I think that it's useful because then you as a person can grow. And then maybe you can go to your family and be like, mom, dad, brother, here are the here's the incredible list of awesome things that you gave me. Here's our, it's a Venn diagram, right? It's a Venn diagram.
Totally.
Here's the, and chances are the good stuff has way more bullet points than the iffy stuff, right? You go to your
Totally.
family and then you're like, these are the awesome things that you did and instilled me with. Here are some areas that I disagree with, but it's coming
Yeah.
out of love. And maybe you'll see it my way one day, or maybe you won't. I still love you anyway. And yes, I think that is the way.
Yeah, I love that. And we tend to either kind of demonize or deify our family system and our family of origin, and the way we grew up, almost kind of a fascist blind loyalty
Mm,
to the dicta of our upbringing. But or we just trash it. It was like just total, just complete garbage. It's, I don't know why we do that. We're just black and white like that. But I think part of growing in discernment is being able to kind of sift through the good and the bad. And it's very archaeological, kind of like paleontology. You have to kind of brush those rocks and bones really carefully, and sift, or like sifting for gold. Like you have to find what's good, and be positive. And even as I've gotten older, I went through a kind of a deconstruct. You got to go through some kind of deconstructive period, though, where you feel like definitely you're more negative than positive, right?
yes.
You got to go through that period, but you will come out on the other side. And as you grow in grace and the goodness of the universe, you will be able to be less of a jerk about it, and to say, wow, I was really hurt by that. But even in the last few days, I've had opportunity to talk to some cousins about my grandma, who kind of helped raise me a little bit. And I've had opportunity to talk to my dad even today. And even in those moments, I've sort of just through verbally processing been able to land on some really good things that they did, some really
Yeah.
beautiful things that they bequeathed to me. And I'm so thankful. And it took your sort of you drawing me out through these questions. I think what you're doing is a great example of what we can do for others as we dig into our own stories.
Well, thank you, Sam. Kind of end off here on this idea that when we are doing this sorting, right, we have to be confident, going back to ambition versus desire and all this other stuff, that when we look our family in the eyes, it is with noble ambitions and noble pursuits. And I think that that's the most important thing. So if you're a young person listening to this, the idea is that you don't just defy your parents and say, I'm pursuing my ambitions of being, addicted to drugs or something like that. That's not what we're advocating for. So we're saying that when you are carefully examining the family setup or the family rule system, when you do confront your parents, you are bringing some like rubies to the table of like, here's my ambition. And I think your brother, when he was in high school, he wasn't able to do that because maybe he was just getting into like teenage nonsense. And like, that's not something you can really, go to your parents with and be like, hey, look, dad, I got suspended from school. This is my ambition. Like, that's not a real gem. That's
No,
not a ruby that you can present or an
no,
alternative. But I think when your brother was able to go to your father and be like, I am involved in muckraking journalism and I'm
yeah,
exposing all of these things, he is bringing to your father a gem of ambition. And I think
yeah.
that's the critical distinction that we need to make.
Yeah, my dad always loved Psalm 127, which is this idea that children are a heritage of the Lord, this incredible gift and unexplored potential, just packed. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And the favored and blessed men and women are like warriors with quivers full of arrows. That's kind of what it's like to have children of with filled with promise, and I think
Absolutely.
it excited my dad that he was like sort of like sending us into the world to carry forth blessing and eventually to wherever we go. And and I do want to make them proud. I want to be an honor to the family name and even to my faith as a Christian. I think that's important and consistent with that. I don't want to be bound by that. I have to become my own person and make my own mistakes and have my own successes and not worship at the family altar. But I also want to make them proud, and then someday I can come back and we can have an honest conversation about where we've been and what we've been up to, failures and highlights, and thorns and roses, and we can learn from each other. I learn from them, and then they can also learn from me, and I look forward to that day for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that the messaging here is that the family value system is intact, but you're just taking your own road in maintaining it. Sam,
Exactly.
thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Aaron.
This concludes the 37th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azrod.